Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bildner session on the Brazilian Amazon. I'm Ken Erickson. I'll be moderating the presentations, and you will be the discussants after the presentations. The two speakers know that they have between 20 and 30 minutes to present, so I'll warn them sometime after 20 minutes that 30 is approaching if it doesn't look like they're getting close to ending, and that will leave time for you. Our two speakers today are Larry Rohter. Many of you probably know the book he did a number of years ago, The Rise of Brazil, when Brazil was on a much more promising rise than its trajectory today. And Anthony Keck is director here of the CUNY Center on, the Advanced Science Research Center, which deals with environment and other scientific issues. And I am delighted that we have a scientist working on Brazil here in CUNY as well. So I'm not going to elaborate more. And in fact, when you two are presenting, I'm going to sit where I can see the screen since I know you have projections, and the other of you should feel free to join me in sitting to see the screen too. So Larry, we're going to begin with you, so go right ahead.
Good afternoon. I guess I'm going to start with a stipulation. Those of you who watch the shows on TV like Law and Order will know that when there's no dispute about anything, there's no debate, all sides accept a fact, they call that a stipulation. And I'm going to stipulate that Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil since January 1st, is just as bad as everything you've ever heard about him, if not worse. He is indeed a bigot. He is indeed resistant to any kind of information. He operates on his gut. He is vindictive. There's a long list of things. Some of them may sound familiar too. Let's stipulate that then. But I want to say something else about Brazilian military men, because Bolsonaro left the army as a captain. I wrote a biography of this man, Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, who is the greatest explorer ever of the tropics, and was a general in the Brazilian army, a statesman, and a scientist, a first-rank scientist. Originally an astronomer, but then because of his duties as in charge of expeditions, cartography, opening up the Amazon, he became an ethnologist, an anthropologist, a linguist. Rondon was the founder of the Indian Protection Service. His motto as he operated on his expeditions was die if necessary, but never kill. And it wasn't just talk. He was wounded, hit with arrows twice, and in other situations had his life at risk, either because of uncontacted Indian tribal groups that were afraid of any kind of contact, or of just the immensity of nature. If you look at his face, as they say in Brazil, ele tem cara de índio. He has an Indian face, and he is, in fact, himself a descendant of three different indigenous peoples, the Bororo, the Terena, and the Guaná. He's also descended from a Spanish general, which is where the name Rondon comes from, and Portuguese. And when I traced his family tree, one of his 16 great-grandparents was of African descent. So he is a typical Brazilian mixture. But he, of course, was raised in the Amazon himself, born in the Amazon. He was an orphan, and through sheer grit and tenacity and enormous intelligence, enlisted in the army and rose through the ranks to become, when he died, a marshal of the army. And his is a humanist model. When he died in 1958, at the age of 93, he was born the month that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He died the year that Sputnik went up. The International Red Cross, in its eulogy for him, called him the second greatest pacifist of the 20th century after Gandhi. This is before, of course, Martin Luther King becomes a household name around the world. But Rondon was a pacifist, was a humanist, and his model for dealing with the indigenous peoples of the Amazon was to respect them and their culture and their languages, and to always treat them with respect and exhibit humility on his own part. It's the exact opposite of what we see going on today in Brazil. Let me just move on here, give you another image. Most people here, I assume, are Brazilianists of some sort, but for those of you who may not be, there you see Brazil superimposed on the United States to give you a sense of the size, larger than the continental United States. And here's the United States superimposed on the Amazon, not just the Brazilian Amazon, but the Amazon basin, and you see how enormous it is. Now, 60% of Brazilian territory is what is known as Amazônia Legal, but only 20 million or so people live there. That's 1/10 of Brazil's population. So you have a real disparity. But one theme that's been constant through Brazilian history, not just in the years, in the century and a quarter that it's been a republic, but even before, is the drive to move from the coast into the interior to explore and develop. And one of the central questions in Brazilian history is, how do we do that? And Rondon provided a model that was viable for doing that. He, in addition to leading these expeditions for sheer exploration, he built telegraph lines from Cuiabá, which is about there, up to Porto Velho, which is there, and also to the frontiers with Bolivia and Paraguay. The idea was to incorporate incorporate the Amazon into the Brazilian nation. Unlike other great explorers, especially those of the tropics of Africa and Asia, his was not a colonialist project. His was a project of national development and a humane model of national development in which he envisioned it didn't even have a name then, but today we would say sustained development, which of course is our theme in this talk. And he was always, if we're trying to think of him as in an American context, we would say that he's Lewis and Clark combined with Sacagawea, with some Daniel Boone thrown in, and also Johnny Appleseed. And the Johnny Appleseed part is especially relevant to our subject today because he's responsible for introducing certain crops into You see where it says RO there, right in the very far west? That's the state of Rondônia, which is named for him. He's the only Brazilian to have a state named after him. And in that region, as he explored, for example, he saw wild cacao. And he realized, well, why not bring some real cacao from Bahia, which is where it grows, southern Bahia, plant the seeds. So he did that. Also coffee. And since I wasn't writing a hagiography, I was writing a real critical biography, let me mention here that he also is responsible for introducing eucalyptus into the Amazon basin. And that is, he couldn't have known it at the time, but that's become a real problem because what you get is monocultures in large parts of the Amazon. Eucalyptus trees originally from Australia grow very, very fast, faster than any other variety of tree. And so in 2015, when I was tracing Rondon's, the path of his telegraph line, mile after mile after mile of eucalyptus plantations. All the other varieties gone. But his idea was a correct one. Every 50 miles or so, there would be a telegraph station, and around it, a colony of settlers, both Indian and, so-called, what they would say then, civilizados, right, civilized Brazilians, growing crops and raising cattle. And it was a self-sustaining kind of model, and it gave the indigenous peoples the option of deciding for themselves the degree of contact they wanted or did not want with Brazilian society. He left it totally up to them. And again, this is 180 degrees from where we are now, where Jair Bolsonaro is saying that the Indians must be incorporated into Brazilian society, whether they want it or not. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the current situation and how Rondon's thought and his model remain relevant. When Rondon came in contact with the people, an indigenous group, one of the things that he did initially, right away, was to demarcate their territory so that it would be clear to all that this land belongs to the so-and-so people, to the Pareci, to the Nambiquara, to the Munduruku. And that's a model that is with a great number of reservations, I would say, still in place today. However, Jair Bolsonaro has said, I'm not going to demarcate any more Indian land. This is ridiculous. These people, I actually have it here. I could read it as a quote. But he said, his argument is, the land we've already demarcated is too much. The Indians are 0.5% of our total population, and they have 13% of our national territory. And some of it is the richest land in all of Brazil. We're going to find diamonds, we're going to find gold, we're going to find rare metals. Bolsonaro has an obsession with niobium, and he's convinced, Brazil is already the largest producer in the world of niobium, but he's convinced that there's more and more and more in the Amazon if we can only get at it. And now, Bolsonaro, of course, one of his, he has, I think, three basic constituencies. An urban middle class that was tired of crime and corruption, the evangelicals, and then what is known as the bancada ruralista in Congress. This is the rural caucus that is composed of and beholden to ranchers, mining interests, timber, agribusiness, and that whole group. And he's really interested in advancing their agenda. And to the point where he has said that he is willing to arm the ranchers and farmers, allow them to have weapons. And he wants to impose on the Indians the right to have mining take place on demarcated land that is now reservations for indigenous peoples. If this past summer, I say our summer, Northern Hemisphere summer, was an especially bad summer, as the world knows. The destruction, however, was not universal across the Amazon. It was concentrated in certain areas, what is called the arc of destruction, which is really, it runs through here. And if you looked at the satellite images from above, it's really remarkable, because in this area here, in eastern Mato Grosso, is the Xingu National Park, which is where indigenous peoples have, they're sovereign there. And when you look, you see this devastation all around the park, but the park itself is green. And this is something that Rondon came up with 100 years ago. He envisioned indigenous peoples as sentinels of the forest, and foresaw the day in which their demarcated lands would be preserves where conventional development would be off limits. This model is under threat, obviously, and there's no telling how things are going to play out. I want to talk also about the way this crisis of the past summer has played out in Brazil and abroad. Within Brazil, and I was in Brazil June, July, August, first half of September. There was not anything approaching a unanimity about this. There was a great deal of pushback and criticism of the destruction that was going on, in this region here. And it became the subject of vigorous national debate. Some of the worst fires were, in fact, in the state of Rondônia, and the irony of that was not lost on Brazilians, and it led to some vigorous pushback against the government. But I want to argue that our response outside of Brazil has actually played into Bolsonaro's hands, because if we had at the G7, we had Macron saying, questioning the concept of sovereignty, national sovereignty. He said, let me just pull this out here. He said, if a sovereign state took obvious and concrete measures that were clearly against the interests of the planet, then intervention by the international community would be justified. He says, the stake for the planet is so high that you can't say, this is my problem, not yours, stay out. We've also had recently an article in Foreign Policy the magazine, suggesting that kind of game playing, role playing into the future, envisioning a situation in which the United States might threaten a naval blockade of Brazil, or airstrikes even, because of another year, another summer like the one we've just been through, and suggesting that maybe the UN, in addition to having blue helmets, should have green helmets to go and enforce climate measures. Also, here in the US, the influential legal blog called Lawfare published on August 27th a article called "Who Owns the Amazon?" Arguing again along the same lines that national sovereignty is a perhaps outdated concept, and saying, does it really make sense to defer to the sovereignty of the Brazilian government in addressing this problem? All this sort of thing gets heavy play in Brazil. And what it does is unify the country behind the president, even people who can't stand him. Because the Amazon, one of those slogans that you hear all the time in Brazil is Amazônia Nossa, the Amazon is ours. And despite that, for most of its history, Brazil has been unable to exercise truly effective sovereignty over the Amazon. So there's this deep-seated fear of losing the Amazon. And anytime Macron or Foreign Policy Magazine or Lawfare or anybody else brings out this concept of disrespecting Brazilian sovereignty, it just causes a storm and works to the advantage of extreme nationalists, both on the right and on the left. So, same thing goes for, I think, boycotts. Some companies, I suppose, trying to prove that they're woke, have talked about boycotting Brazilian products, such as leather. One company did, I can't remember which one it was. And this also seems to me to be a dead end for the same reason. So, okay, I'm being descriptive. How would I be prescriptive? Well, in addition to the obvious thing, which is that of working with groups inside Brazil that oppose Bolsonaro's policies, I think it's important to remember that Brazil's official name is the República Federativa do Brasil. It's a federal republic, and that's the key issue here. It means that states have a lot of autonomy, and that if you can't get traction with the national government, you certainly can try with individual states. And that's a model that's been tried in the past and has had some success. 15 years ago, the state of Mato Grosso, the governor was the largest soybean grower in the world, Blairo Maggi, and he went all in to support deforestation and soybean cultivation. The governor of the next state up, Amazonas, Eduardo Braga, was trying to prevent that from spilling over into his state. And with funding from the European Union, was able to pay jungle dwellers, riverside dwellers, not to deforest. And it worked pretty effectively. So this kind of program, making alliances on a state-by-state basis, I think is an approach that can be very useful. In a way, it's like what we're living through right now here in the US. We have someone in the House who doesn't give a hoot about the environment. And the state of California has challenged that by exercising its authority, and we're getting some pushback on the loosening of federal auto emission standards. The same sort of thing can happen here in the Amazon if you deal with the individual states. Some states have a really strong tradition of environmental awareness. Acre here is where Chico Mendes was active, the great environmentalist. Two of his acolytes, I would say, have gone on to become national figures. Jorge Viana was governor of the state and senator. Marina Silva was senator. She was a presidential candidate and may yet be again. In 2014, she got 22 million votes. So there is a constituency, and I think it's best for us to try to work. If we can't work with the federal government, when I say we, I mean foreigners, then look to the states. Let me go back to Rondon. How much?
23 minutes from the timekeeper.
Okay. Let me go quickly then. If Rondon is known at all in the English-speaking world, it's because in 1913 and 1914, he shepherded Teddy Roosevelt and his son on an expedition in the Amazon that's become legendary for its difficulty, for the dangers that they faced. This is a picture taken the day they ended their trials. That's Rondon off there on the right, with his hands in his pockets, looking kind of nonchalant, I think. There's Teddy Roosevelt holding onto the stake to keep himself on his feet. He had lost 55 pounds on the expedition, and I think you can see how baggy his clothes are. It's one of the great feats of exploration of modern times. This is Rondon with a young Parisi boy. He was incredibly affectionate with the indigenous peoples, and they with him. You know, in my mind, when I was writing my book, I had this picture. I looked at it a lot. You know, to me, Rondon is looking at the boy and saying, "What you are, I once was." And the boy's looking at him and saying to himself, perhaps, "What you are, I may someday be." Here's Rondon again this is on the border with Suriname, showing and explaining a watch, how it works, to an indigenous tribe he had contacted. Here he is in his Johnny Appleseed mode. And this is another shot of him as a two-star general towards the end of his career. Yeah, it was a great pleasure to write this book. I did it just because I was fascinated by his life and the fact that he was a military man, a pacifist, a statesman, and a great scientist. I started in 2015. I had no idea that the book would come out at a moment where the paradigm had shifted in Brazil, and that Rondon would gain an actuality, a currency that he might not have had 5, 10 years ago. All of the humanist values, values of diversity, the values of compassion that Rondon represented are being challenged in a way that they've never been challenged before in modern Brazilian history. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to thank the Bildner Center for inviting me to speak here. I'm Anthony Keck, as Larry mentioned. I'm the Associate Director of the Environmental Sciences Initiative. at the Advanced Science Research Center. So actually we're part of the Graduate Center, but we're physically up on the City College campus. So come and visit. We're a relatively brand new science center and beautiful building, doing fantastic research. So yeah, so I'm going to give you kind of an overview, a nice complementary sort of talk to what Larry talked about, looking at deforestation and really kind of giving you a sense of what's been happening. So if you do a kind of a mapping out the Google search terms for the Amazon basin or the Amazon forest in 4 different languages, you can see there's a huge spike in interest via Google in this past year, even relatively to previous years. And kind of why is that? Well, it's been all over social media. So these are some colleagues of mine, some posts that they made. I translated some of the text from Portuguese to English. Basically, you can see some of the fires. This is near Porto Velho. And then the image on the far right, basically saying that basically the first time in the last 13 years, my colleague saw these sort of logging trucks driving through the city, which the person had never seen before. So
This is in Rondonia. Right?
This is in Rondonia, yeah. But this is a picture I took last year, again in Rondonia, of there was a field just right off the road that was on fire. So from the car. So let's kind of look at the patterns and trends of what's been happening. So Larry kind of showed this, but I just wanted to orient yourselves to the Amazon again. So you can see the red line is the legal Amazon, as Larry mentioned. The yellow line is the actual watershed of the Amazon, and it encompasses 9 different countries, including Brazil. Most of the Amazon is in Brazil, but of course these other countries, are key players, especially because they're part of the upstream part of the watershed. And it juts up to the Andes Mountains, as you can see. And so this is just basically purely looking at the deforestation for the legal Brazilian Amazon states. So you can see here, these are just the raw square kilometers that have been cleared from 1988 until last year. So you can see there was a peak, in the early 2000s. It's declined immensely, but it's starting to kind of pick up a little bit. And just for reference, I put these sort of square areas of both New York and the state of Connecticut. So you can kind of get a sense of what's being cleared relative to sort of spatial areas that we kind of know and are familiar with. If you look at the actual rate, though, so that was the total amount that's been cleared, and this is the annual rate. So again, you see there was a huge peak in the kind of mid-90s, but it sort of kind of fluttered along and then went down again in the early 2000s. You can see there's considerable variability depending on what particular state you look at. The nice thing about looking at the rates is because the states in the Amazon are so diverse and different in size, the rate kind of sort of makes them all equal to sort of compare. So you can see in Rondonia and Mato Grosso areas where there's been a lot of agriculture, you can see the deforestation rate, as you would expect, is much higher than some of the other states that are more forested. However, there's a bit of spatial disparity, as you can imagine, both by state, but if you kind of narrow down to the municipality level, which is one level down, smaller, hopefully you can see this. It's a little dark. So the left panel here is the deforestation by municipality for 2002. The middle is about 6 years later, 2008, and then 2018, 10 years later on the right. So the color scheme is the kind of the more intense red you get, the more sort of clearing that's happened. As you can see, again, there's that sort of arc of deforestation that Larry mentioned, the sort of running from the east all the way down to the south, and you get the kind of more core forest, kind of the northwest part. As you can see, though, it's sort of, as I sort of showed in the previous graphs, it kind of went up and down. And certain municipalities saw more deforestation, some others saw a decrease. Kind of get into that a little bit later. But if you want to really look at the sort of the total amount that's been cleared, basically by 2018, so this is looking at from 2000 to 2018. Again, the same sort of color scheme, the more intense red is the most cleared. And again, you can really see that sort of arc of deforestation happening, particularly in sort of the northeast, in the areas of Rondonia and then also in Mato Grosso. So I know there's been a lot of sort of discussion about, so all the data I just showed you was from INPE, from the National Institute for Space Research, one of the Brazilian sort of government agencies that does fantastic work providing these sorts of data. There was a lot of discussion about, well, whether these data were sort of valid and whether or not, can we trust these data? So this is actually data from another different analytical source. It's a group called Map Biomas, which I'll kind of explain later on in the talk. It's kind of different methods, but you sort of see some of the same trends. Again, this is sort of their sort of measurement of the amount of forest cover. So it's not actually deforestation, but it's the total amount of forest within the sort of the same, again, the legal Amazon, the same sort of states that I described to you. So you can see from 1985 to 2018, there's sort of been a gradual decline. It's been about sort of a 10% decline in forest from 1985 until now. So you can see just this, again, this is pure area. So I gave you a reference for the country of France. So you can see basically about, the size of France has been deforested. If you want to think about it kind of in more local terms though, so if you basically take the amount of forest that was in 1985 and you compared it to the entire size of New York City. So you said all of New York City is the amount of forest that's in 1985. So when you think about a 10% decline, well, Manhattan is about 7% in total square area of New York City. So from 1985 until now, if New York was the size of the Amazon forest in 1985, basically Manhattan would be gone in terms of forest. So that's kind of another way of thinking about what's been sort of declined since then. Again, sort of kind of matching the sort of statistics that I showed you earlier. Again, you see the same sort of rate, and it varies by state for the amount of forest that's been sort of cleared from, like I said, 1985 to 2015. But kind of on the flip side, thinking about things more positively, this is actually a map showing the amount of forest. Again, kind of sort of the reverse of that municipality deforestation image that I showed you. This is the amount of forest. So you can see there actually, despite all the gloom and doom, there's still a lot of forest in the Amazon, which is good, particularly in Amazonas state. So that's kind of a different vision of it. And so there are a number of different sort of basically satellites and systems that are designed to sort of measure deforestation happening. Here's a table that I'm showing you that the sort of X's don't necessarily matter, but you can see there's a broad list of systems that are sort of monitoring deforestation and basically identifying when deforestation events are happening and making them available to the Brazilian government, to other governments, to researchers, things like that. I'm going to focus on one in particular. It's this Deter, it's the very first one. Again, this is basically this is an alert system that is set up and run by INPE from Brazil. And so it basically produces these alerts daily. So whenever there's a deforestation event happening, it shoots out an alert, and then all these data are available to sort of basically access, right? And so this basically shows you from 2016 until basically a few days ago. These are the number of alerts that have sort of been issued from this particular system. And so Deter basically monitors within a 1 kilometer area. If there's a deforestation event, it shoots out an alert. So you can see there's these sort of peaks and troughs that kind of happen through the year, depending on how agriculture and land use is actually happening. I don't know what this is. Can you see this? Okay, so this is basically that same data, the Deter alerts, but kind of mapped out spatially and mapped out through time. So starting from the upper left, which is last October, and if you go across, so going through the year, and then all the way ending on the lower right to basically last month, to September. So you can see there's these sort of alerts are sort of, there's a great disparity across the Amazon as far as when deforestation is happening. Kind of in January and February, you see kind of in the very north, in Amapá state, there's a lot of sort of clearing happening. Whereas you kind of get later into the year, basically the last few months that you've seen, you see a lot more clearing kind of along the roads and kind of along that sort of arc of deforestation. So what does this actually look like on the ground at particular plot levels? And so I'm going to show you a few examples at specific plots. This is actually data from a very high resolution satellite that was put out by a company called Planet. These sort of images come from, again, that map Biomas, which I'll explain later. And so this is a particular farm in Rondônia state. You can see on the left is sort of a before image of clearing happening. On the right is the actual clearing that's happening. In the sort of red boxes that you see, that's the actual clearing that's actually happened. So in this particular property, you can see in the kind of very back half of the property, there was kind of a new field that this farmer opened up. And then also a long clearing that's already happened. This farmer sort of cut away basically at some of the forest. So that's kind of a sense of kind of a small type of clearing. Here's another image of a property where, again, the farmer cleared along what was a road, probably to expand access to the road or kind of build out more agriculture from from the other side, or more pasture, actually, this is probably, because on the right image, it's very much pasture, because you have these sort of interspersed trees. And then here's an example of a really large clearing. So you can see, and these are over the span of from November to May, so it was 7 months or so, 6 months. Cleared about 85 hectares, so it's a pretty sufficient area. And actually what was interesting is, so this map biomas system, which like I said, I'll explain later, actually identified some sort of key areas that these clearings happened in areas that were for sort of a legal reserve, which is the property owners are mandated to protect forest on their property. And then also what's called the APP, the permanent preservation area. So written into the Brazilian constitution is that property owners need to maintain riparian buffers, or basically maintain the land along rivers and streams as unused, right? And so this clearing happened in both of those sort of protected areas, and technically it's illegal, right? But it happened nonetheless. So what's really driving these sort of deforestation events, right? You know, we see everything, you see it from satellites, but why is this kind of happening? Well, this is sort of a little summary slide explaining some of the major drivers of what's actually happening to cause deforestation. So you have, again, a lot of external drivers, you know, international demands, sort of the debt that Brazil owes to international countries, you know, market pressure, social pressure, you know, is certainly affecting deforestation. These are all things that are happening, you know, basically driving and impacting, you know, people on the ground, right? So people who are actually doing the logging, doing the cattle ranching, you know, doing agriculture, or you know, harvesting forest products, right? But then also from within Brazil too, as kind of Larry sort of talked about, you know, there's a lot of sort of internal drivers, whether it be sort of government action or inaction, certain types of markets that the government is promoting, certain types of subsidies that the government is doing or not, you know, not applying. So all these things are sort of, you know, playing into account of why things are happening, and you know, what we see. So one of the key things, especially with forest though, is not just, you know, clearing writ large, but like how forest is actually happening. And forest fragmentation is actually a major issue when you're considering deforestation and clearing, not just in the Amazon, but worldwide too. So I'm going to actually walk you through this sort of diagram here to explain to you this color scheme, which will appear in a few other places. So just kind of bear with me. So you see this big swath of green, right? So this is what's considered core forest, right? So imagine a scenario where someone comes in and builds a road, right? So this road is connected to somewhere else that's already also been cleared. So what happens is you have this what's called an outer edge, right? So the core forest has been split. There's an edge from, you know, an area that's been cleared, and that's kind of the outer edge of the forest, right? This will make sense in a second if you're confused. So I come in, I buy a property, my neighbor comes in, also buys a property next door. That's great. We want to start using this area, we want to start clearing. So I clear a plot of land right off the road, you know, adjacent to my neighbor's property, kind of extending that sort of outer edge of the forest, right? And so what's important is this outer edge is still, the core forest is still connected to sort of the rest of the forest, right? So it's just, you know, there is an edge to the forest, and that edge is kind of more vulnerable to change, right? So if you have wind come in, those trees are more apt to maybe blow down, right? You know, they're sort of more exposed to the elements, if you will, but they're still part of this kind of large body of forest, right? Which is the core forest. But my neighbor decided they found a really good spot in the back of the property. Maybe this was a nice kind of, you know, well-drained area and wanted to do sort of agriculture. So my neighbor cleared a little patch in the middle of this property. Well, all of a sudden you have this little hole in the middle of the forest, and that's called an inner edge of the forest, right? You have the inner edge, which is still part of the you know, larger part of the core forest, but then you have this little hole, right? And that little hole, again, generates all sorts of potential issues for degradation, right? So I explore the back of my property and discover, oh, that's also in my property too. So I decide to clear my back half of the property, but say there's a particular stand of maybe mahogany trees that I want to keep, you know, for later, right? So what I do is that sort of red is basically a small little island of these mahogany trees and maybe a few other trees, right? And so that's what's called like a forest island. And why this is really important is this forest island is really disconnected from the rest of the forest. And because it's sort of surrounded by clearing on all sides, is extremely sort of, you know, vulnerable to the elements and to sort of change, and to things happening that will ultimately lead to its sort of demise, right? So this is the sort of idea of forest fragmentation. Now, does this make sense to everyone? Okay. And so just kind of continuing on, that sort of inner edge, if more clearing happens, becomes basically an outer edge because it's connected to a larger patch. So this is the area of Novo Progresso, which has been in the news this past summer as one of the key areas of fire. And so this is sort of a GIF showing a time frame and a timeline of that sort of patterns that I just sort of described to you. So you can see this is basically going from 2000 to 2018. I'll let it run through a couple times. So again, fire has sort of been in the news. And so what role has fire played in all of this? And how does it sort of impact or relate to the sort of fragmentation that I just told you about? Well, so here's data from another satellite. It's basically from a satellite called MODIS that was run through what's called the Fire Information for Resource Management System. And so basically what happens is this satellite measures, it has a pixel scale of 1 kilometer. So, and what it does is basically if there's a fire within that 1 kilometer square size, it notes that there's basically a fire event happening. So you see here, this is basically the daily cumulative amount. So this is the every day from 2000 to basically, again, a few days ago. You can see here, these are the sort of fire alerts that have happened. So disappointingly, I guess, if you think about compared to the amount of press and sort of buzz that has gotten these fires this summer, this year is actually relatively kind of middle ground compared to previous years. Previous years there have been much more fires, but this year again because of the sort of policies and sort of the kind of dynamics of social media and the awareness. It's really gotten a lot more buzz than actually what we see here on the ground, or from the sky, I guess, in this case. So this is again a sort of GIF time frame of that same fire data that I just showed you, but you can see it spatially. So you see there are some months where there are basically very few fires, and then as you kind of get again later into the year, this basically mirrors the sort of deforestation that I just showed you. And you see coming up, there you go, August. In September, so these kind of a lot of fire events that happened. But again, the same patterns that you see along that arc of deforestation, some clearing at the very top of the Amazon in kind of the early part of the year. And this is sort of the cumulative amount of basically that GIF that I just showed you. So you can see, you kind of get a sense of where these areas are happening. Again, this looks like there's a lot of fire. Not all these areas are on fire, but there are fires in these areas. So just kind of keep that in mind. And why is this important? Well, fire sort of interacts with the forest, a particular fragmented forest, to sort of increase tree mortality. Like I said, sort of describing that, trees that are sort of orphaned from the rest of the forest are more exposed to the elements. And so when a fire comes in, it's really, these trees are very primed to sort of, kind of die, I guess, for lack of a better term. And these are a couple articles from some collaborators from the Woods Hole Research Center, who I work with, and so these are some of the work that they've done. They did a simulated fire experiment on one of their sort of field properties to kind of see what happens and how the forest responds. And they saw, particularly because droughts are pretty prevalent, especially in more recent years in the Amazon, this combination of drought and fire really kind of comes together to sort of affect the forest and increase these conditions where more fires happen and more trees kind of end up dying. And so these are a few pictures that I took. I was actually down on this property last year. So you can see this was what formerly forest that was burned and now is sort of regrowing. Again, it doesn't really look like the same sort of forest. You can get these clearings here, like I mentioned. Some of the logs here, this one's not burned, but this particular one has some burn scars, you can see. Kind of going up the trunk there. Again, going up the trunk. These trees thankfully survived. And here's sort of a good scale. There's the person in the background, and he's pretty tall, but this is also a kind of pretty tall burn. Oh no, all right, well, you get a sense, I guess, of, well, if you were to have seen this, this would loop basically wherever you saw that sort of clearing, the areas of fire also would sort of kind of overlay, pretty much, a direct match, right? So there isn't a lot of fire that's directly affecting the core forest, but a lot of the sort of fire areas are happening in these kind of fragmented forests, and these areas are being used. So what will actually happen to these forests if this keeps going, if it's sort of business as usual? So this is sort of an explanation of the kind of the forest structure, right? So this is a regular kind of forest that you would see. So you get these multiple different levels of forest architecture. So you have very tall canopies, you have a sort of middle layer, you have some understory, and then you have this sort of undergrowth, and these trees are sort of competing for each other, but they're sort of adapted to sort of reach these different levels, and compete for resources, but this is kind of what a forest looks like, right? And what's interesting is, so the evapotranspiration from all these plants comes together with the climate to actually produce the rainfall. So about 30% of the rain that's generated in the Amazon comes from the plants themselves. And so when you start clearing some of that land, you're actually breaking some of that cycle, right? And so the forests are starting to dry out. And it's, what's happening is that you're getting more rainfall in areas that are being cleared and less rainfall from the forested areas because of the temperature differential. It's actually sucking the moisture out of the forests, drying the forest out a little bit more. And so when you're doing this over a large area, this just sort of precipitates and precipitates. And what happens is, as these trees aren't really adapted to deal with these sort of drier conditions, they end up dying out, and these sort of more kind of dry tolerant plants come in, and these plants are from the savanna, coming up from the south. And so you actually kind of eventually you can get what's called the savannification of the Amazon, where instead of having these kind of tall, very complex architectures, you get this sort of savanna like you would see in, say, Africa or in the center part of Brazil. And so some people are theorizing that if this continues, that you'll end up actually with two Amazons. And you kind of can see this now, and you can kind of see this is where it's going, where you have this sort of core forest here that's still big forest. And then, again, where that sort of deforestation is happening, with these changes, it may end up actually being savanna instead of an actual forest. But it's yet to be seen. And everyone's waiting for a tipping point for this to happen, but we haven't gotten there yet. And why this is important is because this sort of climate-forest interaction is not just impacting the Amazon, right? It's sort of impacting all of South America. So you see here, this is a 3D visualization of sort of the elevation of South America. You can see the Andes Mountains are kind of accentuated. That sort of purple line there, that's the legal Brazilian Amazon. And then you see the sort of mountainous regions, say, in the kind of southeast of Brazil. And so what happens is, with the wind patterns and the climate, off the coast of Brazil, evaporation forms clouds. Those clouds are, because of the trade winds, move inland from the east to the west. And they kind of combine again with the forest, like I mentioned, to kind of create more rain, form more clouds, form more rain. So there's about 9,300 cubic kilometers of water vapor that sort of is moved around. And so it's just a massive amount of water. And what happens is because of the winds keep pushing these clouds and this moisture up as far as it can go, and that's basically up to the Andes, right? And these clouds have nowhere else to go. This moisture has nowhere else to go except south, right? So they move south along the Andes. And so basically what happens is the rainfall that happens just off the coast of the Amazon goes through the Amazon, comes to the Andes, goes south, and the rains that you see in, say, Sao Paulo, it basically come from the Amazon in a large respect, or from the ocean through the Amazon. So you can see that sort of, people did calculations, about 3,400 cubic kilometers of the water in the southeast of Brazil actually came from the Amazon. And so why I'm mentioning this is you probably also saw in the news, back in August, there was this big sort of, the whole world was abuzz, the fact that Sao Paulo, and basically in the mid-afternoon, looked like nighttime. And so people were theorizing that this was sort of driven by a lot of the sort of smoke. And because of some of these patterns, the smoke actually did help to precipitate some of the clouds that you sort of see. So it wasn't a direct cause, right? There wasn't a direct connection, but certainly it played a role for this sort of image. So now that you're probably all depressed, is this all gloom and doom? Is there no hope for the forest? And what can we sort of do about it? Well, I can give you sort of a few examples of some of the work that I and some researchers who I'm working with are doing to sort of kind of help the situation. So this is actually a project that I'm working on. You're basically using artificial intelligence and machine learning to sort of better identify what's happening on the ground. So there are a lot of ways to sort of characterize the land, but some of these are pretty difficult, particularly if you're dealing with from a satellite that may have a sort of a limited resolution, or some of the things are just particularly difficult to tease apart. For example, a lot of the roads in the Amazon are dirt roads, and it's really hard to distinguish those dirt roads from, say, a plot of agriculture that's in between plantings that's also dirt. But using these sort of artificial intelligence approaches can actually help to improve distinguishing between those sort of two types of things and sort of kind of get a better understanding of what's happening, as well as sort of a better sort of way of predicting what's going to happen in the future. And if anyone has any questions about that, I'd be happy to talk to you about that later. One of the biggest things that I think is a sort of an improvement, certainly when I was there and doing my dissertation research, but even when I was in subsequent times I've been there, was from property owners where they said they'd be happy to be in compliance with the law, but like we need to know where our properties are and have the government recognize where our properties are. That was the biggest thing, a lot of the farmers who I talked to, said like if they could come with a GPS and measure out my property, I'd be happy to stay within, the legal limits or the realm of the law. Well, this is actually a data set from the government now. They've really done this push to sort of delineate the sort of property boundaries, which is, I think, a really good thing to help people, kind of think about where their space is and sort of, if the government needs or wants to sort of, enact these sort of policies to sort of protect the forest, and that they have the resources to measure what's actually happening.
Where is this? Do you know where this
This is Altamira, actually. This is the Trans-Amazon Highway. This is yeah, this line here. So this is what I mean. Just as an aside, this is the classic fishbone pattern of use. So you see this sort of spine of the major highway that cuts through the Amazon, and these sort of side roads and properties. We'll get into that later if you have questions. And again, I mentioned a lot about sort of these sort of ways of finding out more alerts of what's happening on the ground. I referred to in the earlier part of my talk about this Map Biomas. So it's a group of a multinational group that's also doing a lot of this sort of satellite analysis. And they actually just presented at a conference I was at this preliminary version of this sort of alert system. So this is another alert system that is being used to basically identify where things are happening. And their alert system is such that it actually produces formatted reports that are sent directly to IBAMA and to the particular Brazilian government agencies to say, hey, there was a clearing event, maybe you guys should go check this out. So, people are really doing a lot of work to sort of, identify what's happening and try and, help the government enact change as much as it can.
Timekeeper alert 2.
Okay.
25 minutes.
Okay, I have like 2 more slides. So there was a blog post about a month or 2 ago from Daniel Nepstad, who's a big researcher in the Amazon, and he had a number of like pretty interesting recommendations that I thought I'd just put up here. Basic ways to sort of help the situation with the forest. So obviously better management of fires and better management of the land. These are all sort of hypotheticals and maybe a dream wish list, but they can certainly be enacted if given the sort of will and the willingness to do it. Better education and ways to sort of encourage development that is sort of basically not involving fire and not involving sort of unsustainable ways of doing agriculture and doing sort of mining and things like that within the Amazon. And again, Larry mentioned about the fact about, kind of sidestepping the government and going directly to the states. Well, that was also one of his recommendations is, do business with the states that are kind of enacting these policies. And my personal sort of recommendation would be go visit, right? You kind of get a better sense of the place, if you see it for yourself. And that's a way, if more and more people go to visit, then that's kind of a way to sort of stimulate, hey, there's an alternative approach here. Instead of just clearing for agriculture, maybe ecotourism might be a different way of doing it. So definitely go visit. This is in Rondonia as well. So. Yeah, so that's all I have. So if you have any questions, there's my contact info. Thanks.
Maybe we can put the lights up a little bit. Let me thank the two of you for stimulating, interesting, somewhat alarming discussions or material for discussion. I just thought I'd make 2 observations I was reminded of during the talks. If General Rondon wanted to integrate the Amazon into the country, I was in Brazil about a month ago, and I was speaking in conversation with a guy who's an ecologist, and he talked about the military back in the 60s having a plan where they wanted to develop the Amazon, and the slogan was integrar para não entregar. That is, the fear was at that time, and Larry, you alluded to this, that somebody, and the somebody in mind was, of course, the United States, was going to come in. Before Daniel Ludwig, it was Herman Kahn of the Hudson Institute. Herman Kahn had a plan where they were going to build dams in the Amazon and flood and create something like 5 Great Lakes. I haven't looked at the materials. I may have them if anybody contacts me. I think I may still have those. But it's a kind of thing that if you talk about uniting Brazilian nationalists of the left and of the right, which Larry alluded to, that kind of plan coming out of the Hudson Institute was surely the thing to alarm the military who were in charge at that time. The other thing from your talks that I just thought I'd make a comment on, going to Brazil and coming back, I flew Delta. Maybe this is the same on other airlines as well, but you can track your flight on the little screen on the back of the seat in front of you. And the little screen, like the current touch screens, you can expand. And so I was amazed when I expanded it to the closest focus I could get, and they're using satellite data from one of the US government agencies. And you can see in Goiás and Mato Grosso and areas like that, from your place in the plane on the back of the seat in front of you, all of these cleared areas with the lines, the property lines and things like that. So if you haven't done it, it's because you're watching the movies on the back of the seat in front of you. This is I found very interesting. At any rate, that's just, I found you made me think of lots of things, but those I thought I would share with you, since I hadn't realized how you could use the geographic tracing of the flight and actually look. And you can do it and to see the disappearing glaciers in the Tibetan plateau and things like that, because you have the whole world on those screens. So what I would like to do in Bildner fashion is to take questions 2 or 3 at a time. We'll begin with 3 questions or comments. If there are comments, let me ask you to be brief and concise. And so you, the presenters, should take notes or at least make mental notes of what they are, because you're going to get more than one question at a time. And I'm going to ask you to identify yourselves when I recognize you, and many of you I know. So Warren Hogue, identify yourself. Stand up so everybody can hear you.
I'm Warren Hogue, and I was once the New York Times correspondent in Brazil, which is also what Larry was subsequently. My question is, can you hear me okay? My question is, in the current coverage of Bolsonaro and the Amazon, there's frequent reference to the fact that Germany and Norway had sustainability projects, which they have now abandoned, and the burden of the coverage suggests that something that Bolsonaro did caused them to withdraw their money. Can you tell me what that's about?
Yes.
Don't answer yet. Next.
Okay.
And so I'll take the question in the back row. Stand up, identify yourselves, and say it loud, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sebastian. I'm a Ph.D. candidate here in sociology at the Graduate Center. My question, well, first, thank you both for presentations that were very interesting. And my question is for both of you. And it's about the relationship between science and law, right? They are doing all these different scientific projects in different ways, right? Mapping or going more anthropological science. And so I'm wondering how much of that is integrated into regulations, whether in the local or national level, or other kinds of law expressions in Brazil.
Thank you. And I'll take a question over there, please. Stand up, identify yourself.
Rowena Ellis, Queensboro Community College, and SPS BA Online. I teach a foreign Latin American culture course in German. But my question is, first, I'm hoping that these PowerPoints might be on the site eventually, so I could tap into that for my Latin American culture course.
Mauricio, as director of the Bildner Center, can you answer that specific question?
Yes, we do.
Right.
Yeah, mine's on Google Slides, so I can make that available.
Yeah. So my question directed to Anthony. I saw through your pictures that Bolivia and Peru, especially Bolivia, had a lot of red. So is this not a local Brazilian scenario and spreading over to the other countries too?
Good.
Thank you for the first 3 questions. Larry, do you want to begin?
Okay. Warren, rather than answer your question first, let me go to the other question about science and law. because I think it really touches on something that's central to the whole problem of the Amazon and its future. Sorry. Even in the best of times in Brazil, government agencies that carry out the law are starved for resources. I'm talking about IBAMA, the Environmental Institute, or INCRA, all of these, or the Ministry of Labor entity that tries to eradicate slave labor in the Amazon. All of them are starved for resources. Under the current government, that's now become a policy. We're going to, Bolsonaro said when he was sworn, right after he was sworn in, regarding FUNAI, which is the government agency that deals with indigenous issues. He said, I'm going to chop it off at the neck. And when you have that attitude, of course, in Bolsonaro's case, some of it's personal because, he had been caught fishing in illegal areas and had been ticketed. So he has a personal stake in all of this. But you now have the chronic problem of lack of financial resources combined with the new problem of policy, a policy of strangulation of any government agency that does science or carries out the law. You mentioned INPE, the National Space Research Institute, an amazing institution, and their data is, respected all around the world. And Bolsonaro picked a fight with them this summer when I was there, saying, no, the data, they're at the service of some NGO, and they're deliberately trying to ruin our government and diminish Brazil's image abroad. That sort of ill will leads to these situations where the enforcement mechanisms that follow up on the scientific data that's being gathered are crippled. So that's the one question. You want to add to that?
Yeah, there's actually the second part of your question where you talked about working with anthropologists and sociologists as part of this sort of science endeavor. I can actually speak to that personally. So I work with a number of anthropologists and sociologists, both based in the U.S. and in Brazil, on various research projects. Deforestation. We actually have a project looking at the role of dams and dam construction. And so we're kind of looking at dam construction from two sides. So I'm part of the team that's looking at from the physical science side, so hydrological modeling, sort of satellite image analysis, that sort of thing. But there's a whole other type of part of the team where it's looking at the sort of sociology of dams and dams construction. So how does it affect local residents? What do they think of it? What are the sort of incentives? So
and what about the people who are brought to work on the dams?
Correct.
Who come
Yes.
from other places?
Right. So there's a really strong kind of synergy and tightness in this sort of research. Again, it's sort of taking it to the next step of enacting policy. That's sort of a lot of what Larry sort of alluded to. But as far as the sort of upstream end, it's pretty well connected.
Okay. Now, Warren, your question. Yeah, this is another one of those things where the president picked a fight. There had been criticism of him. There had been doubt about his willingness to, adhere to the arrangement that had existed since the time. Some of it goes back to Fernando Henrique Cardoso, in the first few years of the century. It got into one of these back and forth situations, and the Germans and the Norwegians both cut their money, and Bolsonaro's attitude was, we don't want your damn money anyway. Some of the money has been substituted by Boris Johnson's Great Britain, 10 million pounds. So Bolsonaro is looking for different alliances. He hates Angela Merkel and he hates the Norwegians. And he's looking to find substitutes. There's been back and forth with France, which also was making monetary contributions. It descended to a really stupid and low level when I was there, where you know, the Minister of the Economy actually said, Macron's wife is ugly. You know, that's...
What are the projects? What is it they do, the sustainability project?
Well, some of them were the things I was talking about, where you pay, you know, peasants along riverbanks or in deeper interior not to raise not to deforest, or to do certain activities, or to be guardians of the forest. That was some of it. Now, one little addendum here. I don't think necessarily that all of us out here are exempt from criticism, including the Norwegians. I once did a presentation in Oslo where I was asked, what can we as Norwegians do to help the Amazon? And my answer was, prohibit Husqvarna from selling chainsaws. Because those Husqvarna chainsaws are the most sought after kind of chainsaw in the Amazon. The steel ones are very sought after too, but Husqvarna is the gold standard for chainsaws. You're used to seeing that too.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different ways you can clear forests. There's certainly chainsaw. You could burn it or try to burn it. You know, obviously that takes a lot longer because the trees don't die immediately. And if you're doing a really large kind of set of clearing, and I've seen this where they'll take a tractor and put two tractors, put a chain between it,
Yeah,
and just literally drive down and clear a plot of land.
Yeah.
So, no, I mean, this is areas that, yeah.
Anyway, that's an aside, Warren.
Yeah.
And then, okay.
Yeah, the third question. So, so thank you for actually, for bringing up the bit about Bolivia and Peru. I forgot to mention Bolivia and Peru. It was very Brazil focused. But yes, so these are obviously the same sort of patterns that you see playing out in Brazil. I mean, obviously the sort of drivers are somewhat similar. The government policies might be different, but a lot of the kind of bigger market drivers are you know, playing out in some of these other areas. So it's a lot of the same trends that you see. Again, you know, deforestation is very, very well correlated with road development. And so it happens in other countries too.
And if I could make an observation, so much of the deforestation these days in the Amazon, whether Brazil or elsewhere, is driven by soybeans. And, you know, soybeans, there's the two largest producers and exporters of soybeans in the world are the United States and Brazil. Argentina's in the mix too. But, you know, it depends what year it is. And that's relevant because when Donald Trump picks a trade war with China, it's a boon to Brazil, and that helps drive deforestation. And it's a boon to Brazil's neighbors too. I mean, northern Bolivia, which I think you showed, you know, that's also, you know, becoming soy territory.
Well, it's soybeans and it's also cattle ranching.
Sure.
And then and mining actually. So in Bolivia and Peru particularly, there's a lot of exploration for oil and minerals. So.
Okay, now let me take the next three. Yes, please stand, identify yourself, and speak loud.
Andrea Vieira. I am a journalist. I used to be a city council in Rio de Janeiro, and I'm opposed to Rede, which is the political party of Marina Silva. We worked together in this last campaign. And my question is, we know already what you can't do in the Amazon. We can't mine, you can't do soybeans, you can't expand agricultural work in the forest. But what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
Who is really studying and trying to give an answer for this question?
Thank you. Next question right there behind you. Go ahead. Stand and speak loud, please. Identify yourself.
Actually, I was in Altamira in '72, and it's changed a lot since
It's
then.
changed, yeah.
We had a fazenda sort of halfway between Rio Branco and Chapuri, and dealt directly with Chico Mendes. You both implied, but you didn't specifically these fires are not forest burning.
Right.
They are pastures that were previously cleared that are being burned as they are every year, and some new clearing. I mean, having cleared a lot of land in the Amazon, one wishes that forests would burn. It won't. It will if you, as you point out, Anthony, if you sort of isolate a little block, you can get it to burn. But pure mata won't burn. Even in the driest of years, it won't burn. It has to be cleared. It has to be cleared and dried. But the most of the fires, and you did imply this, were pastures being burned as they are every year. And I think that needs to be, I think there's so much misinformation that has been put out in the press, which is great that it raises awareness. But I think we should try to make it accurate. I think it'd be more effective. Excuse me for.
Thank you. Yes, last question over here for this round. Identify yourself, loud.
My name is Judith Kimmerling, and I teach at Queens College, and I also work in the Amazon in Ecuador. And areas that were green on the map, but actually are being degraded because of expanding oil extraction, which doesn't show on those maps. But
And being resisted by indigenous peoples, right?
yes, who prefer ecotourism as their alternative.
Yeah.
And yes, and it's a serious problem, and there are also scientists there who are saying that they're finding, there are studies of biodiversity in Yasuni, they're actually finding lower biodiversity, lower population numbers near the oil operations, even though the forest is still standing. So I don't know how to measure that, you know, that's more complicated when we look at these maps and see where the green is, where the red is. But my question is, I thank you for your comment, because I've really been puzzling over what's happening in Brazil and what the drivers are for the deforestation in the new areas, right? Not the reburning, but the new areas. And I was wondering if y'all could comment a little more on that. One thing that I've heard is that the loggers go in first, and they sometimes build, you know, rough roads, and after that, you know, the cattle ranchers follow in. Can you comment on what are the main, a little more about the dynamics for the destruction of the new forests, the new areas, and especially when that involves the displacement of the indigenous peoples? I'd like to have a better understanding of that situation.
Well, those are the three for this round. Anthony, would you like to begin?
Sure. So to sort of address the question of what we know we can't do, but what can we do, and you know, who is studying this? So it's difficult to. I mean, obviously that would be the sort of, you know, Nobel Prize winning answer. You know, what can we do to save the forest, right? But I can actually give you an example again of some of the work that I'm involved with that may sort of be one application of that. So I mentioned this study that you know, where we're looking at sort of hydrological dams and dam construction. So I neglected to sort of mention the sort of main thrust of the project is that, you know, there have been longstanding plans of dam construction in the Amazon. You know, people get enticed by this. There's all this water. You know, we can harness this water for energy generation, and you know, that's sort of somewhat true. You know, doing a lot of these sort of large dams, particularly the Bella Monte near Altamira, is actually not great, because you know, a lot of dams are designed for these sort of, I mean, there are a couple ways to do dam construction designs, but one is, you know, taking this differential between, you know, a higher area and a lower area, and that sort of difference is the energy that can be generated. But you know, when you get sort of further inland, you know, and kind of closer to the Amazon River, you know, it's very flat. So you can't necessarily generate a lot of energy, even though there's a lot of water. And so, but like, this is all to say that there have been these plans to do dam development. You know, obviously with the sort of Brazil's economy and, you know, some South American countries' economies, you know, those plans have been put on hiatus, but you know, that may come to fruition, you know, once the economies pick up. But you know, and this construction is very disruptive. It's disruptive to the environment. It's disruptive to the people. Even though it's great, it's a renewable resource. And so the aegis of this project is basically, you know, notwithstanding the fact that this construction will happen, you know, can we sort of propose alternative solutions that may sort of mitigate or reduce the need to sort of dam a huge river, right? And so those are some of the technologies we're exploring. We're actually looking at sort of using the sort of a combination of solar-driven solar panels That say, for example, if you already have a dam and you want to generate energy, you could put these sort of floating solar panels on the reservoir, if there's a reservoir, and as a way to sort of increase more energy generation without having to build another dam, right? Or, that could be a way for some of these smaller communities in the Amazon to be able to get energy, say through solar panels or in-stream turbines, where they don't have to be connected to the grid and therefore kind of drive this sort of development. So this is just one example. I mean, there are probably many examples, but that's sort of what I can kind of tell you as what can be done.
I'll go in a different direction.
Yeah.
My grandmother was Scottish, and she always used to say, many mickle make muckle. A lot of little things together add up to a big thing. And so, I think of these miniature projects all over the place. Now, Marina Silva's home state of Acre has been a pioneer in this. There was a deal that Pirelli, the Italian tire manufacturer, signed with rubber producers in that state for sustainable, green production of rubber for their tires, and also, and this is what got all the headlines, for condoms. That worked. Fragrances, also from Acre. There's been a marketing problem with some products that come out of the Amazon because there's an American company with a similar name that claims that it has the ownership of all products that have Amazon in them. And so the real people who live in the Amazon are unable to market their goods in English-speaking countries with the name Amazon in it. But those are little examples. Aquaculture is another example. In the area around Santarém, where the Tocantins flows into the Amazon River itself, there's been some really splendid work done with aquaculture. Lots of things like that, because the river dweller, the peasant in the interior, he and they don't want to be millionaires to be happy. You can really satisfy their basic needs with some projects that don't look spectacular, but do yield really concrete results. Let's see, that's
So there's a bit about the pastures being previously cleared. So that's true. Like you had mentioned, the core forest doesn't necessarily burn. And a lot of the pastures are burned every year to sort of maintain the clearing. It's sort of, there's sort of slash and burn agriculture, which is probably what you've heard about. And so that's actually
traditional.
Yeah, which is traditional. And actually, that's actually one of, if you're going to do agriculture in the tropics, that's actually one of the more efficient ways to do agriculture at the small scale, right?
Right.
And do this at the large scale.
Indigenous peoples have been doing it forever, but on a small scale, and they're nomadic peoples.
Right. And so what happens is, like, you burn the forest, it generates, a set of nutrients. But at the small scale, you cut down the forest, you burn that, right? So most of the nutrients because the tropical soils are very nutrient poor, and most of the nutrients actually come from the litterfall itself. So if you burn it, right, you have this sort of, kind of productive soil for a little bit of time, but it won't last forever. And so that's why if you do it at the very small scale,
you rotate it,
then it could be an efficient way to do it. But when you do it at the large scale, it's a whole nother question. But it's very true, the pastures are one of, the burning is, but it's, of course, when it gets loose, which is, a potential concern, then it becomes a problem.
Just as an addendum, you talked about misinformation and how important it is to get accurate information out there. I have one pet peeve, which is this phrase that the Amazon is the lungs of the planet.
Yeah. It's untrue.
Do you want to, as the scientist, do you want to tackle that? Or?
Most of the oxygen comes from photosynthesis or from algae. Yeah. So I think people are mistaking that sort of. I mentioned the cycle of evapotranspiration and oxygen generation. It's sort of being misconstrued as adding to the larger climate. I mean, it is, but it's not. It's not like if the entire forest was cleared down, we would be starving of oxygen. So.
Yeah, but now carbon sequestration is another story.
Right. That's correct.
So.
Yeah. And then the other question was the drivers of deforestation in new areas.
Well, the displacement of indigenous peoples.
I mean, it's a complex situation, and it's changed over time, right? So certainly some of the policies of development, you know, back during the military dictatorship, you know, obviously were major drivers where, you know, there was another slogan for the Amazon that the dictatorship had, which is they declared the Amazon was a land with no people. For
land
people.
without men for men without land.
Correct, yeah. So it was this idea that no one was living in the Amazon, which is untrue. And, you know, so we'll put people there, they'll do agriculture. And that was also a way to sort of, you know, basically deal with those sort of sovereignty questions, right? If we have people there, then it's ours, right? So that was, you know, that was a driver, these sort of small family farmers, right? But in terms of, you know, today's, you know, day and age, you know, there's probably some of that, right? But certainly, you know, I think as you get these sort of larger conglomerates and larger kind of landowners, you know, they have the resources to sort of move into new areas, and then they may feel actually emboldened, you know, because they have this sort of larger wealth and power to actually do that.
But specifically about indigenous peoples, which I think was a specific concern of yours. I'm running into increasingly a new generation of indigenous activists who are professional people. Indigenous lawyers, indigenous scientists, indigenous sociologists. And they are very effective advocates and protectors of their own cause. Indigenous agronomists. You must know some that you've run into.
A few, I've worked more in that.
Yeah. And that, I think, is a game changer. For the first time, you know, there's the Brazilian congressional election last year, a woman lawyer who's a member of the Wapixana people was elected to Congress. That's only the second time an indigenous person has served in Congress. Her name is Joênia Wapixana. And that's, you know, that's a step forward. There's a case right now where the Inter-American Human Rights Court is considering a complaint brought by the Terena people of Mato Grosso do Sul. And the lawyers, the lawyers approached me, and they're indigenous Brazilians, and they're working with, you know, Native Americans to take this case and try to get a ruling which the Brazilian government would recognize, putting the brake on some of Bolsonaro's more outre initiatives. Good.
Let me take more questions before I come to those who've already asked. Yes, please, you go ahead. Identify yourself and speak loud.
I'm Nick D'Agostino. I'm not a professor or reporter, just interested. I've lived many years in Brazil, so I'm curious. Is there any, once destroyed, is there any chance in like human terms of return growth to the forest? That original complexity.
Thank you. Yes, please.
And my question is actually piggybacking on hers and yours. So reforestation, right? I have two examples. I'm from the south of Brazil. My mom had to cut a paideira in the garden, and we had to buy 20 trees to donate to the city. And I know another case, Salgado, that famous photographer.
Yeah.
He went back to Minas and he saw his area where he grew up destroyed, and he bought land and put thousands of plants there. And now they say the animals are coming back, the plants are growing. So are there other initiatives like that of reforestation?
Did I see a hand back here? Nope. Okay, and let me just add one thing that isn't a question but a comment. We've been talking about the fires, and I was in the Cerrado, and that is an area like parts of the west of the United States that is a fire dependent, or at least fire is integrated into the economy there, and it's fire from lightning strikes and things like that, as well as people who may be setting fires. But we should understand that not all of the fires in Brazil are set by people trying to clear land. The Parque Nacional das Emas, where I was, had a fire, I think it was 10 years ago, that burned 95% of the park because it's cerrado and it's not dense, wet forest like the rest. So I thought I would just add that, a little bit of nuanced complexity to the question of fires. They are not all the same kind of thing.
Right.
Now,
Like in California.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, Larry, you go first.
Let's see here. Any possibility of return? Well, yeah. I mean, but it's never, it would never be the same. I mean, first growth forest, once it's gone, it's gone. And as I mentioned, I think in my talk, traveling along the highways in Rondonia, you see the replanting, but it's monoculture. It's, it tends to be eucalyptus, eucalyptus, eucalyptus. And I don't think, that's desirable from a scientific point of view. You lose the diversity, not only of the trees, but of the animals that are, the animal life and plant life that's dependent on that. So yeah, there are ways to bring it back, but it's never going to be the same as it was, is the short answer. Maybe you want to give a longer scientific answer.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, but I guess would be my answer. The forest will grow back, and these forests grow back very, very fast, right? So secondary forest growth. Certainly being naive when I first went to the Amazon, I was walking around with a farmer, and he was pointing out different areas that were, that they had cleared and were regrowing. And to me, I couldn't distinguish between the two. I mean, he very much could, but it looked like it was the same height. These forests like just shoot up, right? But then, through time, you get those sort of, the turnover of species, right? As initial succession and what have you. So, these forests will return eventually, given the fact that if they're in close proximity to other areas of forest, right? If you get these sort of forest islands, then, it's much more difficult for them to sort of get a chance to kind of grow back. But it also depends on what your sort of question is, too. There have been sort of, propositions and proposals that maybe agroforestry might be a way to sort of, sidestep this sort of, clearing of the land, but, you're using land, but differently, right? So there are some parts of the Amazon where they're growing. So there's a city called Tomiyasu in the eastern part of Pará state, where it's actually a bunch of Japanese colonists who have found ways to grow like 30 plus different crops in the same plot of land. And so these are crops that are largely like forest crops, right? So, you have a mahogany tree, which is, protected, but you could certainly clear that if you wanted. You have cacao trees, which, for chocolate, and you have a whole host of other crops, right? Which,
they're famous for their hot peppers that they grow there, right?
Yeah. And, architecturally and sort of functionally, this is very much like a forest, right? You have that same levels of complexity. It's certainly not the same species. But if your concern is carbon sequestration, for example, that could be a way to go. But if you want to sort of preserve the species, then you have to, kind of do these other sorts of things. So, I guess does that answer the reforestation question too? I don't know. I mean, I don't specifically know of initiatives. I'm not involved in that work, but certainly like Sebastião Salgado's work is an example. And certainly talking about the question that was asked about Norway and Germany, certainly funding some of these efforts. So again, it all goes back to what Larry said. There are these little things that are happening, and the hopes are that if you do a lot of little things, then it adds up to a big thing.
Right, and some of the little things that work can be replicated in other places once you facilitate communication between people. I mean, we're talking from the western Amazon to the eastern Amazon. It's a couple of thousand miles. And you need initiatives to bring people together where people can talk and say, well, this worked for us, and here's how we made it work. This didn't work, and here's why it didn't work. That sort of communication is a way to get, these experiments
but there's
more widely spread.
There's no way to do sort of a blanket kind of policy across the Amazon. I mean, as Larry showed, the Amazon is huge, right? And so, there's as much sort of diversity within the Amazon as you would expect and as you would see in the continental US. So what may work in one part of the Amazon might not necessarily work in another part, given, say, the topography or the rainfall, or if you're closer to the Cerrado, you sort of deal with fire as an issue. So there really has to be these sort of kind of localized approaches.
I see two hands going up to address this question. Let me ask you to go first. Identify yourself and speak loud, please.
I'm a visiting scholar at Columbia, the Center on Global Economic Governance. Well, I'd like to tell that as a Brazilian, I can see that democracies are subject to waves. Like this country that just got out of the Paris Agreement. That's something that you have to hear. We have a kind of extremist attitude of this government, but the opposition is so high. The Redi, which is Marina party, is having a lot of opposition. This president has already retrospected of his attitude. As Mr. Professor Keck showed, there is a lot of instruments that monitor the Amazon. And we can see the previous government, the P.T. government, devastated a lot of Amazon, making a dam. In Amazon, there is no level, it's horizontal. It flooded an immense area, basically for corruption. All the engineering companies bribe the politicians and got the works. So that's the complex country like this one. And I'm an optimist that things are going to be better than these fires that happens in California, in Siberia, in Portugal, the climate change. So things are going to be on the right tracks. I can see that.
And Judith, you had a follow-up on the same topic, I think, right?
Yeah, no, I'm done, sure. I think that's a really interesting.
Yeah,
So-
I mean,
So we throw the
sure.
throw the
I mean,
question on the
I
table.
think, it's interesting that in all of the coverage of this terrible summer, well, dry season, I should say. I shouldn't say summer or winter or whatever. People keep saying, well, it's the worst that it's been since 2010. Well, who was in power in 2010? The PT, the Workers' Party, was in power in 2010. So this is not an ideological issue in a way, because, we talk about Marina Silva. Why did she leave the Workers' Party? Because this developmentalist push from Dilma Rousseff and Lula made it impossible for her to remain. So they're on the left, Bolsonaro's on the right, but there are certain issues or attitudes that transcend ideology.
Let me just add one more thing in this discussion. Anthony mentioned that the soil in the Amazon is very poor. And at least for most of my students here in the temperate zone of the United States, they're wondering, how can it be poor when you see all that rich growth on it? And one of the reasons that the soil is poor is because all the nutrients are in the rich growth you see, because it's tropical and warm and growing season year-round. And our soils in the temperate zone are rich because we have fall when the leaves fall and enrich the soil. And so that when you get North Americans saying, well, you can just clear and do all these things and farm it, Henry Ford, Daniel Ludwig, and others, they don't understand the fact that the soil is different because the climate is different, and it is not like temperate zone soil like you have in the Argentine Pampas or in the U.S. Great Plains and things like that. So I thought I would just add that. Any other observations?
I would make one addition to
Go
that,
ahead.
Which is that there are pockets of really rich soil, Varzea, as it's called, which tends to be, riverbanks.
Floodplain, yeah.
Right, floodplain.
There's a second one too. It's very isolated, and it's mostly at the mouth of the Amazon. It's called the Black Indian soils. Have you heard of this? Yeah. So there's a type of soil called the Black Indian soils, which are basically cultivated black soils like you would see in the temperate U.S., but they've been cultivated through time, and they're very isolated. But no, to add to his point, you can do agriculture in the tropics for sure, even though the soil is very poor. You just have to do a lot of sort of inputs and investment. So a lot of these sort of large scale fields, you have to apply a lot of fertilizer in order to kind of maintain maintain that growth, particularly because the clay basically sucks up all the phosphate, just given sort of how clay operates. So you have to add a lot of phosphorus and a lot of nitrogen to agriculture.
That includes pastures,
Pastures, not as much. I mean, you can.
but
And
the soy.
I mean, so pastures. So farmers do add some fertilizer to pastures, but it's more for actual monocultural crops. A lot of that burning that was sort of mentioned, that's a way to sort of rejuvenate pastures. And certainly there people or farmers will actually leave pastures to fallow in a way. So you get these what they call dirty pastures, where it sort of starts growing back, and then they sort of move to another area, and then the cattle go in. And again, it depends on the soil type, and it depends on like the varzea and sort of the upland soils are much worse.
Last chance for comments, questions, observations. In that case, let me
Finalize a little bit. First,
stand and say it louder.
Professor Rohter said about the Indians. The Indians, they don't have the property of the land. Property is the government, the state. We are rented, kind of rented to the Indians. So the soil is property of the state. That's the law. Second is, it's a so complex problem that a long time we have seen that there are many international interests in the Amazon. There are many NGOs, not probably shouldn't have called NGOs. They are exporting, they are mining illegally. They are bringing materials from outside. Even in the 1900s, foam archers came from Germany and from scientists, and they brought a lot of herbs from Bass and other companies. There is a controversial thing that we have to deal with this problem. It's not like Bolsonaro's doing, but it's a very complex. Suppose that you are an American and you have a very big land here and you have to treat that strategically. It's a complex thing.
Final observations from the table?
No, I mean, we pretty much touched on, what our agenda was. I think we've pretty much covered it.
So let me thank the Bildner Center for organizing this, thank our speakers, and thank you for being the commentators.